As underrated as the prequels are agreed to be, no one seems to acknowledge the fact that The Phantom Menace was nominated for Best Sound and Best Sound Effects Editing in 2000. This is probably in part due to the innovative methods used here, like Zam Wessel's speeder, which is a 1950s electric guitar, or even the cough of General Grievous, which was just a recording of George Lucas with bronchitis on set. But today I'll go over multiple effects like these and how they were able to make a sound mix that hasn't been topped since.
Brains.
For episode 1, roughly 1,000 new sound effects had to be produced at the rate of about 10 to 12 per day, which means it would have taken 83 to 100 days, or about a quarter of the year, working non-stop to get the task done. And this actually kind of hits home for me because I've worked on a lot of projects in the past that have taken just way too long to do. And yes, there have been many nights where I've stayed up till 3 a.m. trying to find the right music to use on a video. The sound designer Ben Burtt returned, who had also worked on all previously made movies, that being Star Wars Episode 4 through 6, and thankfully Ben is still alive and well. He's luckily only 75, so I'm sure we'll get many more years with him yet. When he came on this production for The Phantom Menace, Ben actually used the synclavier, which is alike to the synthesizer, and was basically like a keyboard that played an expansive library of sound effects and variations of said sound effects on each key rather than musical notes. I feel like Kanye West also had a thing like this in an interview I saw, but they're probably completely different instruments. It's still pretty cool that you could have like a keyboard like this that you could just do all of the mixing and sound effects for just by playing on it. Definitely a good innovation and technology here for the prequels. Also, for all the information on the Phantom Menace's sound effects in this video, I'm reading from the Making of Episode 1 book, which I happen to own as I couldn't find much on it from the internet. I mean, usually those behind the scenes documentaries are pretty good, but they had basically nothing on the mixing for this one. And 1 out of 3 really cool random facts about the sound effects from this movie is that 1, for the sound effects of the crowds that were crucial to the excitement felt during the pod race scene, Ben Burtt went to a 49ers football game and brought a revolver there, which he fired up and then recorded the crowd's audible reactions. Okay, just kidding on that one, but I seriously thought when reading this that it said revolver, not recorder. And I mean, Ben would be pretty unhinged if he managed to pull that one off, but hey, pretty based at the same time, right? But yeah, he brought a recorder and caught their reactions to the game, as Lucasfilm wouldn't be able to hire that many people for that sort of sound effect. Also, for the sea monsters, he started with whales, but according to Lucas, this was too high-pitched, so the sound was changed to a mix of deep marine life sounds and land-based mammals as well. And yeah, those creatures definitely had more of a deep sound, which was apparently supposed to fit with sort of the murky look of the visual effects done by Dennis Moraine. For most of the ships and vehicles, they used World War II aircraft propeller noises, but slowed down, and they almost always have some sort of pulse to them rather than a constant hum. And also they were altered digitally, but for the tanks of the ground battle, the team opted to use the raw sounds of the motors instead. Expanding upon the pod racers more, Ben does his best to give all the ships in Star Wars their own personality to fit their respective characters. And for the pod racers, there could, in his own words, be many moods like powerful, angry, comical, smooth, cool, hip, old-fashioned, goofy, or dangerous. And I guess Sebulba may be dangerous, hip, one of those, I'm not really sure. Definitely one of the better sounds in here, I would say. And some of the pod sounds were made from items you wouldn't have expected, like electric toothbrushes and even shavers. And did you know that the lightsaber sound was actually an accident? Ben Burtt, who was still the sound designer for Star Wars back in the 70s, had already recorded sounds of an old projector for part of the hum, but the rest of it was made from when his microphone got too close to an old TV, and then a signal from it went through the mic, causing an audible buzz. And for Darth Maul's double-bladed lightsaber, it was actually updated by adding a ripple to it. Ben states that while with vehicle engine sounds, people would have no experience with them, and therefore you can make up something completely new. With languages, that is not the case, because with them, you have to keep a ring of truth around it, as everyone is familiar with the basis of how other people speak. He based the speaking of the Neimoidians off of of foreign-born people speaking English. So to answer that whole controversy about the Phantom Menace being racist, well, honestly, I don't feel like dealing with that right now, but especially not with the whole Watto conspiracy. But it seems that it was probably inspired off of dialects, while not necessarily meaning to poke fun at them by any means, but instead simply to exaggerate the alien nature of them to outsiders to an extreme that creates a new alien language. Also, with the Gunganese language, they had inverted phrases and a mixture of English and nonsense words that combined to make it feel like a subculture of Naboo. And I couldn't really find much on why the Gunganese language was so inspired accent-wise by a Jamaican accent, but probably because of Ahmed Best, now that I think about it. So overall, I feel like the Phantom Menace definitely started off the prequel strong with its sound design. I really love the Naboo starfighters and the Vulture droids. Also, the lightsaber sound effects definitely got updated here, as we discussed earlier, which made them sound even more modern and better. And the biggest thing is probably the pod racers. They just sound really good, especially Sebulba, and really that scene would not be nearly as good without all those effects, and I feel like in the theater that would have been pretty remarkable. So I definitely love to hear if I could get any stories in the comments about that from all you. And before we move on to episode 2, here's what Ben has to say about the career of sound designing.
A film such as Star Wars, the soundtrack is completely fabricated. All of the sound effects you hear in the film are added later. Everything from footsteps to cloth rustle to the handling of props to the sound of vehicles, weapons, aliens, and exploding Death Stars. Those are all things.
On to episode 2, I'm going to pull more so from the featurettes than any book, and Ben Burtt returned, of course, for this one as well, and actually went back to some of the old tapes of the original trilogy to find unused samples, but since the chemicals in the tapes were degrading due to old age, they had to heat them up in an oven for them to work.
If they're left in too long, you end up with this interesting piece of art.
Also worth mentioning is Matthew Wood, who was a big help in these films as supervising sound editor, and is also famous for voicing the B-1 bow droids here, and of course in the Clone Wars as well as General Grievous in the Clone Wars, and according to him, it can sometimes take a year before they get to the mix. For the Geonosian language, known as Geonosian Hive Mind, a mixture of sounds were created in Melbourne, Australia, from the mating calls of a penguin to fruit bats fighting over a banana. So I guess I didn't quite elaborate on that one enough, but yeah, that is pretty cool that, like, those are such bug-like sounds that we think of, but then it turns out they're just like penguin sounds and fruit bats fighting. So yeah, also apparently a flying fox was used as well, which is just like a really big fruit bat, but also, you know, not at the same time. Many old mechanical sirens were collected for various purposes in the mix, and one notable one was a 1942 gas air raid siren, which had an awful screeching sound developed into the dive of Anakin's XJ6 speeder. Also, another World War II biplane was used for the sound of the LAAT gunships, and then pitched up for the sound of the Geonosian fighter. It's pretty cool how even though these ships sound so alien, they actually turned out to just be World War II planes, which I probably wouldn't have expected like you. Unfortunately, all of the lines for episode 2 had to be re-recorded for the movie, as the frequency of the cameras was the exact same as the actors' voices, causing it to be ruined, and also in scenes like the speeder chase, the wind machines would make it even worse. So it truly is impressive that they were able to make this all work and sound so smooth. I mean, I never would have been able to tell this otherwise, although I do wonder if it genuinely might have affected the quality of the movie, at least subconsciously, as this is personally my least loved of the 3 prequels, but I still love you, Attack of the Clones. Many Foley sound effects had to be made too, like the Acklay stomping around in the sand, the Coens skittering across the floor, or even, yes, the kissing sound effects, which made for a very awkward day on set, I'm sure.
That one was not so good.
For the sound of Zam Wessel's speeder, in my opinion, one of the most satisfying in the film, they actually used an old 1950s era electric guitar by running your fingers up and down one of the strings and recording it through an old amplifier. Ben Burt actually plays drums in a church band, and he asked guitarist Dave Weaver to make the sounds for him one day after practice. The idea behind her speeder's sound design is that it was more magnetized. It was more magnetized and less reliant on the rocket's power, but rather the automation system of Coruscant. Lastly, for the moment you've all been waiting for, with the seismic charges during the asteroid chase, Ben needed a sound that had dramatic contrast to the rest of the effects leading up to this point. He then, at the last minute, late into the mixing process, came up with the idea of an audio black hole of sound where it all disappears for an instant before being released, as he reasoned that all energy was being pulled into it and no sound could possibly escape. Also for the arena scene, percussion, horns, and crowd sounds were added to make it more exhilarating, and I must say it worked with those drums in the background. Also, the Acklay is a mixture of pigs, wooden pallets dragged across the floor, and dolphins clicking, and I feel like pigs get used for a surprising amount of the sound effects in these movies. I'm looking at you, Sarlacc. Okay, just kidding. Turns out that's like the only one where I actually thought I knew what it was, but it's not even a pig, it's actually an alligator. Attack of the Clones has just as good of a mix as The Phantom Menace in my opinion. I think the Zam Wesell sound effect is excellent. I think all the sounds in the Coruscant speeder chase are great. The sound design of like the Jango Fett Obi-Wan chase is like insane, because like that literally makes the scene right there, so definitely notable on that one. And you know, just the rest of it's really great too, with that final battle and all the arena and the blasters and stuff there is pretty good as well. Finally, on to Revenge of the Sith. In Ben Burt's segment on the featurette, he mentions how much goes into orchestrating the sound. Also, we see how they have to go in and record all the grunts and effort sound effects from the actors like Hayden Christensen here, who casually starts hitting some push-ups to give a good performance. Now that's my guy right there, and it really does show in his physique in the film. For the Foley of Anakin's clothes, they had to give off a more menacing sound, so they went with an old leather jacket, an old rifle, also an old drill for the more mechanical audio, which is kind of crazy considering how it's barely present in the final mix, or sometimes it's just completely inaudible altogether. For General Grievous's cough, there's actually a pretty famous explanation behind this, where George Lucas had a bad spurt of bronchitis on set, which inspired this cough after him. And I like to imagine George coughing like Grievous around set for a few days. Bless his heart. Oh, and they actually did use his coughs as they're recording in the film, which means that yes, this is always George coughing here, and they also had to go back and change the 2D Clone Wars by adding this moment with Mace here at the end. So from what I'm reading, apparently General Grievous being a cyborg was actually designed purposefully as foreshadowing for Anakin's turn into Vader at the end of the movie, which is a pretty subtle but cool detail come to think of it. I mean, I feel like I kind of knew this already. I probably read it somewhere. For the lava of Mustafar, all of the little poppings and bursts of lava are composed of mortar artillery shells and also flowing liquid water, whereas the eruptions of volcanoes in the background were from wind and thunder too. Also keep in mind that these, like much of the pre-production on these movies, the sound design by Ben Burt was recorded on Skywalker Ranch, which I'm sure was peaceful but still stressful nonetheless. And note that Ben had help from Tom Myers on this one with cutting up and also of course bouncing all of these sounds and score together to make it all work. Also, many different holograms appear in this episode. Ben states that like the ships, all of the holograms also have their own personalities, with the Sith ones having a darker tone. Darth Sidious's in particular was specialized for his Sith presence, and even included a very, very slowed down version of a jet plane firing a Vulcan cannon, which itself is an electronically driven machine gun that fires 100 bullets per second. So I saw somewhere that Revenge of the Sith kind of got lazy with the sound mixing and that they relied more on the score, but first of all, I completely disagree with that. I mean, this one has just as many notable effects with like Grievous and the Magna Guards and all that stuff. I mean, I don't know, this one still has like an excellent sound mix. The only difference is I think this one just focuses a little more on the score in some scenes, like the action scenes, rather than on the sound effects like in the pod race or the asteroid chase from the previous two movies. This one really focuses on the score because this one is such a tragedy. But anyway, that's it for this video. You can subscribe if you want to. There's also a join button, which is completely optional, but would truly help me out and the channel if you want to do that. We stream almost every Saturday now, so don't miss those. These types of videos come out every Friday at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I also post shorts on Saturday. But yeah, see ya.